And I would caution against a very common dynamic that happens both within biblical studies and theological studies, which is misunderstandings and kind of these entrenched camps that fire across at each other. I think the best chance we have at a robust doctrine of the atonement is to have biblical scholars that are deeply enmeshed also in conversation with the tradition, and have historical theologians and contemporary theologians that are also engaged with the biblical literature. There needs to be conversation going back and forth. There needs to be robust dialogue. To arrive at a concept of atonement requires exegesis, theology, philosophy. It requires it all. Hey everyone, welcome back. This is going to be a little bit different. I'm doing the first ever reaction video, not a genre that I really traffic in much or care to, but there was a recent video done, a review of Dr. Andrew Rillera's really excellent book, Lamb of the Free, on Sean McDowell's channel. Dr. Sean McDowell had Dr. William Lane Craig on, and they pretty seriously, I think to their minds, critiqued the book. There's a couple reasons why I wanted to make this reaction video. One, this is just a topic that I'm really interested in. I spent a lot of time studying sacrifice and atonement, done some publication on it, plan on doing some more. I do have some of my work linked for those that might be interested in the comments section, but I really did value Dr. Rillera's book a lot. There are some places where I have substantive disagreement. I haven't had a chance to really lay those out necessarily in print, but there are some places where we disagree, a couple places in our interpretation of some of the sacrificial rituals, and then maybe in how we exegete certain New Testament passages. But overall, I thought the project was really well done. Really helpful. I think it is kind of two projects happening simultaneously. One, an attempt to take down penal substitution as a whole. And then secondly, a really careful engagement with biblical texts. And I think to do the former, you would have to do quite a bit more than what was done or maybe possible to do in a book of this nature. I mean, this is a big conversation, obviously, but an important contribution to the conversation, at the very least, is Dr. Rillera's book. So really grateful for him and for his work. I don't know him that well personally. We've interacted a couple times. He seems like a really great guy. We run in the same kind of circles. And so for everything I know from him, he's a really wonderful guy. I like him a lot. Not doing this to defend him per se, but just to say, hey, I really value his work. And then also the other reason why I wanted to make this reaction is I think that a lot of the things that Dr. Rillera is wanting to correct in this book, particularly around misunderstandings of sacrifice, that's something that I'm also passionate about. And I'm really concerned that in this critique marshaled by Dr. Craig, it's just really rehashing old ideas that are misunderstandings of sacrificial rituals. And I'm going to give you some examples, some places where they misunderstand the rituals. One, they demonstrate ignorance of scholarship, really post Jacob Milgram, but also they don't really seem to know the ancient sources very well. They seem to assume that all Jews, ancient Jews, believe certain things about sacrifices that the evidence just doesn't bear out. And so I'll give you some examples of that. I think that sacrifice and the theology surrounding sacrifice is actually really beautiful and contributes a lot to Christian theology. I am concerned. I mean, that's really the heart behind this, is I'm concerned for a more accurate representation of what's happening in Leviticus. So this video isn't going to be like a debate or a takedown or anything. I mean, that's not the spirit of it. And I'd be happy to have further conversations with people who may be interested in this. But I'm making this for people that really want to understand what's happening in these sacrificial rituals as best as we can understand, and understand what's at stake in these interpretations. So that's the heart behind it. And I hope it's helpful to some. I intended to try to review the whole thing. And as I started getting into the video, I just realized I just didn't have the energy for it. So I stopped about midway through. There may be other points that Drs. McDowell and Craig make that were worth interacting with, or they may come back and say, hey, why didn't you deal with this or that we said? I did my best to deal with with the parts of it that I watched. And I will say there's a lot in there that I think is problematic. And so I want to present a case for correcting that as best as I can in the larger quest for truth, understanding these texts, because I believe it's important. And this channel is for people who agree with that. So I hope that's helpful. And we'll go ahead and hop into this review. All right, here we go. Let's see what they have to say.
Book challenges the traditional understanding of penal substitutionary atonement. The book is called Lamb of the Free by Professor Andrew Remington Rillera. And here to respond is the one and only Dr. William Lane Craig. Thanks for coming back.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Sean. Good to be with you.
Well, I've gotten a ton of questions about this book, and you and I actually invited Dr. Rillera on to have a conversation about this in person. He declined for reasons I won't go into, but
I'll just say that I haven't watched the entire video that they did, but I watched parts of it, which is why I'm responding. And based on some of the initial responses and the way they framed the conversation, I kind of understand why Dr. Rillera might not have wanted to be a part of this.
People to know that we invited him to have a substantive conversation about this. And in light of the book's importance, you and I felt it was still necessary to do a response nonetheless. So before we get to his book, maybe you could just lay out for us, what is penal substitutionary atonement?
Penal substitutionary atonement is the doctrine that Jesus endured the suffering that we deserved as the punishment for our sins, thereby freeing us from our liability to punishment.
That's a great, simple way to put it. And I do want to say before we jump into more questions that you actually deal with a lot of the kind of objections that come up in this book.
I think it's going to be clear that the conversations about atonement that are coming forward are happening on different planes. And so while Dr. Craig has laid out a simple version of penal substitutionary atonement, he's written on atonement, there does seem to be a mismatch or a lack of understanding between some of the conversations that are happening at the biblical and theological level. There's also, of course, different versions of substitution and of penal substitution. And, depending on the theologian you speak to, one version may be more defensible than another. So it is helpful to keep that in mind as well, that when you get into the nitty gritty of the concept of substitution and how it's been discussed, its relationship to satisfaction within the tradition, there's quite a lot there. And so, yes, in simplistic terms, it may be helpful to kind of give a shorthand of penal substitution, but recognize that there's a lot going on broadly within Christian theology with respect to this concept and with respect to the objections. And Dr. Craig, to his credit, has dealt with a lot of, I think, more of the philosophical issues dealing with penal substitution. But as will become clear, I think he's not as well versed in the biblical conversations. And I think it's important to note.
In your book, Atonement and the Death of Christ, I would actually consider it a decisive refutation of his points. So how is this project similar and different from typical critiques of penal substitutionary atonement? And what's kind of the case that he's trying to make?
Most criticisms of penal substitutionary atonement focus on the first aspect, the penal aspect. They want to deny that punitive aspect of the doctrine that Christ was punished for our sins. The argument is usually that an innocent person cannot be punished for the sins of another. But that plays almost no role in Rillera's book. It almost never comes up. Rather, remarkably, his critique is aimed at the second and third element, namely substitution and atonement of all things. He does not believe that Christ's death atoned for our sins.
So this is actually highly misleading and a misreading of the book. And I'm trying to understand how Dr. Craig could have misread in this way. You'd have to really not pay attention to what he's doing with atonement language throughout the first 2/3 of the book to come to this conclusion. But let me just say a couple things here. First off, the reason why the book is not dealing as much with the first part of penal is because that part of it tends to come up in the more theological, philosophical discussions of atonement, which is not particularly what Rillera is doing in this book. It is clear that he has issues with the penal part, and that comes through in parts of the book, but his is primarily a biblical theological look at that. So that's why the penal part doesn't come up as much. In terms of the substitution, yes, Rillera thinks that the substitution is in an appropriate category to describe atonement dynamics in the biblical text. That's something that I think I disagree with him on. I think there are elements of substitution as has been understood in the tradition, and I don't think that substitution and participation have to be pitted at odds with one another. So that's probably an area where I have something of a substantive disagreement with Rillera. But to Dr. Craig's last point about denying that there's atoning value to Jesus's death, that's absolutely not Rillera's argument. And this is a huge issue. the way that McDowell and Craig are framing this conversation misses the point right at the outset. Rillera is focusing on the concept of atonement as described in the priestly source of the biblical text, the verb kippere, the PL stem of the KPR root, what that means in sacrificial context and what sacrificial atonement looks like. That has a particular dynamic, and that word gets translated to make atonement. So it's very easy for us as English readers to assume that our synthetic theological concept of atonement is all embedded in the word when we find it in the Bible. And Rillera is wanting to distinguish those two, right? To distinguish between what we might call sacrificial atonement and atonement writ large. And in that larger sense of eschatological atonement, yeah, absolutely. He thinks that's exactly what Jesus' death and resurrection does for us. He says that throughout the book. So I don't understand how Dr. Craig could come to that point. What Rillera is arguing is that the idea of sacrificial atonement as operating within the cult, that doesn't play a leading role. He would maybe argue, even if almost no role, in how Jesus' death as salvific is presented in the New Testament. And that's part of a larger argument he has about the rightly so, that seeing the cult as dealing with certain sins, but once the system breaks down, once you have exile and a broken covenant, you don't have a sacrificial system. So you need some extra means of atonement and of the new covenant to bring about the new covenant. And that's part of his larger argument that's going on. So to say that he doesn't think atonement is in play in Jesus' death and resurrection is highly misleading. It's a misreading of the book, and it's a failure to understand the distinction between, again, what's happening with the word used in our English Bibles, atone, in the Old Testament versus our larger theological concept of atonement. I'm suspecting that's going to come up again and again in this review, but I think that's important to highlight at the outset.
And he does not believe Christ was a substitute. So the book focuses on those latter two elements of the theory.
Now, what's interesting is the penal component. You've written on this in a couple books. Typically, is philosophical and legal objections that people raise. This book is largely exegetical, and that's his expertise, and it kind of stays in his lane, which I appreciate.
The irony is that neither Dr. McDowell nor Dr. Craig in this video really stay within their lanes. They're going to appear quite confident that they understand the biblical literature, the secondary literature, the extra biblical literature that goes into our understanding of what sacrifice is in the Old Testament. They're going to come off as quite confident that they know what that is, even though that's neither of their lanes. The second point, and I would caution against a very common dynamic that happens within theological studies, which is these entrenched camps that fire across at each other. I think the best chance we have at a robust doctrine of the atonement is to have biblical scholars that are deeply enmeshed also in conversation with the tradition, and have historical theologians and contemporary theologians that are also engaged with the biblical literature. There needs to be conversation going back and forth. There needs to be robust dialogue. To arrive at a concept of atonement requires exegesis, theology, philosophy. It requires it all. So I don't think actually this is one where we can just quote unquote stay in our lanes. I think we need to be in conversation with one another, but we have to understand what the other side is saying. And this video, as we'll see, in many ways is an exercise in missing the point.
Be curious, what's your sense of why you think this book has gotten the attention that it's gotten? After all, there's regular critiques of penal substitutionary atonement.
Well, for one thing, it is the most detailed biblical critique of the doctrine that I have yet seen. And so that would be important. But then also, I have to say that this book is really appealing to those who are attracted to so-called progressive Christianity. Rillera's critique.
All right, I'm just going to pause it here. This part, I didn't watch the full video in responding, so this is going to be an interesting experience, but I just watched the first few minutes, and this is the part where I felt like I really did need to respond. To frame this conversation as one of a conservative, whatever, traditional evangelical versus progressive is so profoundly stupid It's driving me crazy. The conversation here has nothing to do with progressive Christianity. It has everything to do with exegesis and understanding of the biblical text. And Rillera might be wrong on certain points. I think he is wrong on certain points, but his understanding of the Old Testament sacrificial system is on point for the most part, in my opinion, and it's in keeping with basically post-Milgram scholarship on Leviticus. So to frame this as, oh yeah, we're trying to be progressive here, it just misses the point, and it's already kind of poisoning the well for an honest conversation. Framing it this way it's a huge mistake. And this is a big problem we have in American Christianity. I'm grateful for the time I spent over in the UK and in Germany in different contexts where this kind of divide doesn't exist. But we have this mindset of you got to be either in a progressive or conservative camp, and those things are both theological and political at the same time, and everything is blurred together, and we're always trying to figure out which camp are you in. It makes it really hard to just have an honest conversation about what we see happening in the biblical text. And so I think it's really unfortunate that this is the way that Dr. Craig has chosen to frame this conversation.
Penal substitutionary atonement is part and parcel of an effort to deconstruct traditional Christianity and to reconstruct in its place a different version of Christianity that.
The other thing I would just point out is that while I do think that the doctrine of penal substitution, rightly understood, rightly explicated, has merit, the idea that it is just traditional Christianity is also really problematic. Would a Protestant be able to say to an Eastern Orthodox person who doesn't really have the doctrine of penal substitution as part of their life of worship and theology, that they're the more traditional? I mean, we have to be honest here. This is not at the very center. We're making something absolutely central, which is not traditionally central for Christianity. The theologian Robert Jensen says, you can believe basically anything you want when it comes to the doctrine of atonement. If your Christology is on point, you're good. There's no council, there's no creed that says you have to believe X, Y, or Z when it comes to the atonement to be an Orthodox Christian. There's just no historical grounds for that. Does that not mean you can find elements of substitution throughout the Church Fathers? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely you can. And I don't think the Church Fathers pitted substitution and participation against one another. I don't see evidence for that. But this idea that penal substitution is at the very center of the Christian faith, and like anything beyond that is going out into dangerous progressivism, I think is just, it's just unfortunate that he's framing it this way.
Appeals to motifs like social justice, anti-hierarchicalism, egalitarianism, and so forth.
And so these things are bad. Social justice, egalitarianism, these are bad things. I mean, that's what you're suggesting, right? By framing it this way.
And this agenda appears very clearly in the foreword of the book by his doctoral mentor, Douglas Campbell, and then in Rillera's own introduction to the book. Let me just read you a couple of sentences from his introduction. He says, the title, Lamb of the Free, is an intentional, if unclever, pun on the self-conception and identity the United States projects into the world in its national anthem as the land of the free. My aim is ultimately to showcase the liberating message of the gospel as an act of resistance to other notions of freedom on offer in the world as represented in the U.S. national anthem. So those who are attracted.
So a couple thoughts here. One is, I do think that the book was framed in such a way that, you know, we all have the choice to make as authors. And I do think he framed the book to activate a certain response. And I certainly think Campbell's foreword does that as well. And it got the reaction. It's gotten the reaction here from Dr. Craig. I do think it's worth, though, thinking about what the words he just read were and the reaction that it elicited. If I was going to paraphrase it, it would simply be to say that as a biblical theologian, I want to make absolutely clear the the liberation that's offered in Jesus is very much distinct from, and even in some ways opposed to, the concept of freedom as presented in American identity, the kind of freedom that's promoted as American exceptionalism, right? Why is that wrong exactly? Like, I'm not saying, to me, that's unrelated in many ways to Rillera's wider argument. I think this book is actually kind of like two books, one nested in the other. And I do have some, my own concerns about certain parts of it. But why is it wrong to make that clear for people? And why is that a progressive thing? Do we not think that within evangelical churches, that's a point that needs to be made? I mean, I didn't grow up in the church, but like some of my first to Julys in church as a young adult, I mean, I remember seeing the American flag hung down over the cross. I'm not even talking about the flag like next to the cross or draped around the cross. I'm talking about the flag covering the cross. And then the pastor thinking it theologically wise to say that the American story and the gospel are basically the same thing, right? Like, that should not be a progressive issue. That's an issue that we should all be clear on, that these things are not the same. It's astonishing to me that that's even controversial, but we press on.
To a progressive version of Christianity will undoubtedly find this book appealing.
Yeah, that also jumped out to me right in the opening introduction. There's a tie to a certain political agenda and a certain view of God that's being dismissed or critiqued, about a God of kind of justice as opposed to a God of love, which we hear in progressive circles. This book has also received some endorsements from some people that probably would not be characterized as progressive, which
should also indicate to you then that just characterizing it as progressive drivel is off the mark. Look at the scholars that endorse the book. Some of them maybe consider themselves progressive, but these are biblical scholars that have thought carefully about these issues. And they, while they might not agree with Rillera on every point, they find great value in many of the arguments of the book. And that's exactly what I would say as well. There's certain parts of this book that I disagree with, but it's an incredibly valuable book, very well done, and helpful in many ways. To not be able to distinguish between those two things and to just react like this is, I'm already frustrated, but let's keep going.
Also create a little bit of firestorm and drama tied to this book as well. Now, before we jump into a critique, I'd love to know, as you read this and studied this, what positive contributions jump out from it that you think are commendable?
I think that its detailed analysis of biblical texts is very commendable. It is very meticulous in examining the biblical texts.
I agree with that. I'm glad you put it out. And I also feel, like I said earlier, he really stays within his lane. I try to do that, but he's in biblical studies. He's an exegete, and he really focused on that in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I think that's his strength. All right. So in critiquing this book, which is both scholarly and dense, you're concerned that some people might miss the forest for the trees. So what are some of the broad pivotal mistakes that you think he makes that affect everything else? Maybe highlight some of those before we get into some of the details.
Good. Let me mention 5 such pivotal mistakes, Sean. Number 1 is that one of the major methodological failures of Rillera's treatment of the atoning significance of Jesus' death is that rather than allowing Jesus and the New Testament authors to reinterpret Old Testament sacrifices, Rillera uses the Old Testament narratives as a sort of Procrustean bed or constraint upon New Testament theology. And since we know that New Testament authors felt free to reshape Old Testament materials, this is just bad methodology.
Okay, so there's an extent to which I might agree with Dr. Craig on this point. Most of the book is focused on Old Testament text, sacrificial text, and I think Rillera demonstrates that he understands this material quite well. I think the issue then is, I'm not sure that one can jump strictly from P's theology or the priestly theology of Leviticus jump from that directly to the New Testament without paying attention to the ways in which concepts of atonement, metaphors, and things like that have shifted and morphed. So in some ways, you could say the book is an exercise in rigorously applying kind of like Jacob Milgram's analysis of the priestly source to all sacrificial language in the New Testament and running that exercise in that way. And I think that's problematic. So I think Dr. Craig is right in principle that one has to allow later writers to reframe earlier conversations or to understand them in different ways. We have to recognize that Jewish writers writing in the first century are going to have a whole host of concepts, conceptual frameworks for thinking about atonement that may be drawing on, earlier texts produced by, the priestly school, but they may not have exactly the same ideas. They may be drawing on other ideas as well. So it's probably not sufficient to just kind of go from one to the other. So I think that could be a problem. On the other hand, it is the case that Rillera looks at all the New Testament texts and evaluates them on their own merits. So he's not simply taking his reading or his theory of Old Testament sacrifice and plopping it on without thinking. He is looking through the New Testament text, but I do think there are places where maybe his reading is colored by a larger schema that he's bringing in. So it's a worthwhile point to consider for sure with this book. It's very possible, I would say, that Rillera is right for the most part on his analysis of Old Testament texts, but overly reductive in some ways on his analysis of some New Testament texts. All right.
Second, he mistakenly believes that substitution and participation in Christ are incompatible motifs and cannot be combined in an atonement theory.
So I don't know. I mean, he definitely pits the two against each other. I don't know if he would say they're theoretically incompatible. He simply wants to argue substitution is not a part of it. So he frequently points to participation as the model that he thinks is sufficient for the most part, or representative participatory kind of model. But he absolutely wants to get away from substitution. That is clear.
I think that this is the most fundamental and hence most consequential mistake in the book. And he gives no argument for the incompatibility of substitution and participation. We can agree that Jesus is not construed as a substitute in an exclusionary sense, a sense that excludes us, but without thereby abandoning substitutionary atonement. As I explain in my book, Atonement and the Death of Christ, Christ is our substitutional representative. He is both our substitute and our representative, so that Christ functions as our proxy before God. And that combines these motifs of substitution and participation.
So I do think that what's happening here is telling, and I think it's a reason why this book will not move the needle for people that are already, have thought theologically, philosophically through penal substitution and have landed on that. The only way to completely undermine that concept, you need to go beyond the biblical text. You really would need to discuss the various ways substitution and satisfaction and so forth have been understood within tradition, and then demonstrate why those are insufficient. Deal with a variety of other points. It would need to be a much larger book, and it would need to probably be several books. Impossible to do, of course, but that's why I think that in some ways this book is kind of two books in one. And I think Dr. Craig's response here is probably representative of how many theologians in his camp would respond.
Thirdly, Rillera denies that Christ's death was an atoning sacrifice. This is an astonishing.
No, he doesn't. As I said, this is a misunderstanding, a really bad misreading of the book. You would really have to ignore how he uses the word atonement in the book to come to this conclusion, because very early on in the book, he demonstrates that when he's talking about this kind of atonement, it has to do with the verb kiper, this PL stem of the kaf pe resh root, and that's what he's talking about. When he then transitions to talk about what he describes, I think, maybe as eschatological atonement, that might be my own language, that's kind of how I think about it, some grander atonement that transcends Israel's cult. That's what he's talking about later on. And so yeah, to say he denies the atonement in this way it's misleading. It's a misreading of the argument.
He doesn't think that Christ's death did anything to cleanse us of sin or expiate our sins. And what makes it...
I mean, what? Yes, he does. Like, he lays it out. He lays out the model for the Spirit cleansing the believer. He absolutely does. I don't understand. I mean, you would really, again, I'm really starting to doubt. I'm getting to the point now where I'm really starting to doubt that this book was read very carefully. When they said it was dense and scholarly and a lot of exegesis, I wonder if the eyes maybe glazed over large portions of the book.
It's really difficult for him is that the New Testament uses cognates of the Greek word to atone 4 different times in reference to Christ's death.
Yeah, so what he's referring to here is the use of the hilask root. This is a term that has something like, in its Greek usage, to do with like propitiating a deity. We see it all over the place within texts, on inscriptions, and there's a really important conversation to be had about why the translators of the Pentateuch, those who translated the Greek Pentateuch, the Septuagint, why they chose hilaskomai as the equivalent of kiper. So it's an interesting conversation to be had. It is interesting how infrequently the hilask root does show up in New Testament texts. Probably an indication that you can't roll everything into sacrificial atonement or atonement related to sacrificial metaphors. But yes, it does show up, and Rillera does deal with these texts. I'm not convinced by his exegesis, and particularly of Romans 3:25, where it says God set Jesus forth as a hilasterion. There's different ways you can go with that. He basically follows Adolf Deismann on this point, as it's a kind of a conciliatory gift. And then, of course, I don't think you can get away from it in the Johannine literature, and certainly it's evidenced in Hebrews as well. So you can't get away from sacrificial atonement playing a role in the New Testament, but Rillera seems to think it plays a pretty minimal role. So again, I think it's a problem if you're just going to have a concept of, if you're going to talk about the concept of atonement and say, I'm just going to isolate the hilask root in the New Testament. Well, then if you do that, I mean, I'm sorry, but the atonement plays very little role in the New Testament based on just the word. So there's several pieces that need to be unpacked here. I feel like all of that's kind of just being flattened out in the conversation that these two are having.
So that Rillera has to reinterpret these verses in such a way that they don't really mean atonement. So just to give one of the 4 examples, 1 John 2:2 says that Jesus is the atonement for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world.
Yeah, and he doesn't deny that statement. I think he's just, again, trying to distinguish between his understanding of cultic atonement and the broader synthetic concept, or the eschatological atonement that the New Testament writers are after. So he has a section on that in his book, and you can read his account of that. And whether or not you find it persuasive, it's not accurate to say he just denies that verse has anything to do with atonement.
With regard to substitution, which he rejects, he has to interpret the Levitical sacrifices in such a way that the animal's death is not a substitution for the death of the offerer.
This just demonstrates a real ignorance. I'm sorry to put it this way, but a real ignorance of scholarship on this. All of the experts on, I mean, okay, you can find some who, for their doctrine of atonement, really want to hold on to this, but most experts, especially following Milgram, recognize that the death is not a substitute for the worshiper. There's actually no evidence. It never says that in the biblical text, and you won't find that in Jewish sources either. But that's a concept that was read into animal sacrifice by Christian theology. That is to say that because Jesus was our substitute, and because his sacrifice is in certain ways analogous to ritual sacrifice, therefore the idea of substitution needs to be found in these animal rights. And it's not there. And that's actually not a revisionist idea. You don't find the concept of animals being substitutes anywhere early on in the tradition that I'm aware of.
His claim is that animal sacrifice has nothing to do with the animal's death. And this is based, I think, on a misunderstanding of ritual. A particular weakness in his case against substitution is that Jesus cites Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant in reference to.
So notice that we just jumped from animal sacrifice to Isaiah 53, which has nothing to do with animal sacrifice. So already you can see Dr. Craig is assuming the dynamic of what the servant does in Isaiah 53 is equivalent to or analogous to what happens with an animal. Otherwise, how else would you explain the jump he just made? But that's his assumption. That's not anywhere in the text. So just notice that move, because that's I think that's part of the problem.
His own death. The servant of Isaiah 53 clearly suffers a vicarious atoning death on behalf of others. And Rillera almost completely overlooks Isaiah 53 and its New Testament deployment.
No, he actually looks at Isaiah 53 in the New Testament. Again, I think you just need to read the book more carefully. He absolutely does. He does not think Isaiah 53 has to do with ritual sacrifice. I think he's absolutely right about that. There's no indication that it does. The one term that people try to shoehorn in is the asham term and relate that to the guilt offering. It's much better understood simply as collective guilt of the people. He's right. Dr. Craig's right. Yeah, the servant does die vicariously for the people, for the collective guilt of the covenant infidelity, but that's not animal sacrifice. Two really important articles that I'd recommend on understanding what's going on in Isaiah 53. One is in the book, the Suffering Servant, Isaiah 53 in Jewish and Christian Sources. The article is by, Bernd Janowski. I think he has a good analysis of the Asham there. And then also David Moffat's book, Rethinking the Atonement. He's got a really important article, building in some ways on Janowski, analyzing Isaiah 53 and then its use in 2 Maccabees 7. And one thing I would flag for you just to consider, I do think absolutely there's vicarious suffering of the servant in Isaiah 53. But here's something to chew on. All of the earliest receptions, demonstrably pre-Christian receptions of Isaiah 53, do not take this text in a substitutionary way, in the way that we now understand substitution in Christian theology. That doesn't mean that our understanding is necessarily wrong, but it is food for thought. All right. So 3 places that I would point you to check out. One, the ending of the book of Daniel very clearly understands the masculine, the wise ones. They're likened to the Isaiah servant who's handed over, and then they are exalted. They're lifted up. So as a result of their faithfulness, God vindicates them. They're exalted. They're lifted up. This is one of our first instances where we get like explicit conversation, or at least gesturing to resurrection at the beginning of chapter 12 of Daniel. There, very clearly, the masculine are not substitutes for all of Israel, but they are a kind of representative for a people, or at least a remnant thereof, and they're vindicated as a result of that status, just as the servant is vindicated at the opening of the servant poem. The second one I would point you to is Wisdom of Solomon. The last part of chapter 2 very clearly reads the righteous sufferer, the Jewish person in the diaspora here in the Egyptian context, playing the role of the servant in Isaiah 53. There's no indication that that person is suffering as a substitute for the rest of the people, right? You could say that the diasporic suffering is in some sense a result of collective suffering of break of covenant. Wisdom doesn't even go in that direction, but that's probably the most you could say. But he's a representative of the righteous sufferer. The third one, which I just mentioned, 2 Maccabees 7, the seven sons and their mother, they clearly identify themselves as playing the role of the servant, as Isaiah 53, suffering on behalf of the sins of the people. They are not substitutes, though, for all of the people. Rather, their fidelity in death leads then to a flipping of the script, where now we turn from covenant curses to covenant blessing and retribution against Antiochus and so forth. So there's no sense in which you find this robust idea of substitution as an interpretation of Isaiah 53 in pre-Christian sources. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong as it's come to be understood later, but it is worth thinking about.
In his book. Finally, number 5, whenever anybody offers a critique of traditional Christian doctrine, we always need to ask ourselves, well, what do you have to offer in its place? What is your view?
And of course, anytime someone says traditional Christian doctrine, we have to ask the question, how traditional, whose tradition, and so forth.
And here it has to be said that Rillera's own non-atonement theory, if we can call it that, remains.
I wouldn't call it that because he doesn't call it that. But if you want to mischaracterize it, feel free.
Underdeveloped and hence seriously deficient. In the conclusion of his book, he summarizes what he takes to be Paul's basic narrative logic of salvation. And it goes like this: Jesus was truly human in every way, but he remained fully obedient, died, and was resurrected. His resurrection means that Jesus has defeated death and broken sin's lordship over mortal flesh. Now, this theory raises many unanswered questions. For example,
but it sounds remarkably like many of the church fathers.
How did Jesus, a mere man on his view, live a sinless life?
Okay. I'm not going to get very far in this review. I don't think I have the energy to review this whole video. We'll see how far we make. A mere man. You just stuck that in there. Nowhere did he say he thinks Jesus is just a mere man. He's just emphasizing that the humanity of Jesus is absolutely necessary for atonement. That's just good biblical theology that's in keeping with the emphasis of the church fathers, that he assumed our full humanity to heal it. So I don't understand why you would stick that in there. That plays no role. There's no, it's been a while since I read the book, but I cannot think of a single sentence where I ever once questioned, does he think Jesus is actually divine? Just doesn't come up.
How does Jesus having direct contact with death make it possible for him to overcome it? How did his resurrection break sin's lordship? How does defeating the ultimate result of sin serve to defeat sin itself? And most importantly, how does being victorious over death enable Jesus to effect our moral purification? This last crucial step remains entirely unexplained. So his own alternative is not sufficiently developed to be compelling.
I would agree to an extent that the alternative he provides at the end of the book is not sufficiently developed. I think it would be great if he did try to develop it in further research and publication so that people could assess it. But there is an extent to which, yeah, you would need more space to fully develop it. And I think that's fair to a point. Again, it's a lot to ask for one book. And in my mind, this is still kind of two projects nested together in one.
So you're not convinced by his interpretation, let alone his reinterpretation of what these passages mean.
Yeah.
On both accounts, you don't think it matches up. Now, I do want to highlight, I think this is maybe the second one, because we're going to walk through some of each of these in a little more detail for people. But I think in the second one, you were making a point that it's not participation in the death of Christ or substitution, but when we talk about what Jesus accomplished, there's multiple facets to this, and all of them are important. It's inclusive, not exclusive, and he never justified why it is participation, can't also be substitution. Is that?
Yes. I mean, I agree with what Dr. McDowell says here. I would just say that he's not justifying it because his argument is it's not there. Whether he's right or wrong, that's his argument, that he's trying to demonstrate there is no substitution in any of the texts where people find it. That's his argument. It's not that the two are necessarily incompatible. He might feel that way, but his argument is that there is no substitution in the texts where people find it. That's it.
Is that a fair point?
That's absolutely it. Yes, Sean, that's correct.
Okay, all right. So let's jump into some of these in a little more depth so people track with us. He begins his critique early in the book by claiming that within the Levitical sacrificial system, the animal's death is not a substitution for the death of the offerer. To make his case, in part, he reinterprets the hand-laying ceremony to simply mean, quote, "This is my animal."
Here's the huge problem. Dr. McDowell seems to think that's a reinterpretation, but the idea that the hand-leading gesture is an indication of substitution is actually a later idea. And I'll prove it to you in a sec. I want to see what Dr. Craig says in response to this, but that this is part of the problem. People are just not aware of the literature. I mean, you need to spend serious time in Leviticus, scholarship on Leviticus, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, Josephus, other Jewish texts, the what's so-called Old Testament pseudepigrapha. Like, you really need to spend a lot of time in these texts and in the literature about them to wrap your mind around a lot of the concepts that we just assume we know. And it's not a reinterpretation, as I will demonstrate in a moment. But I just want to highlight even the language of saying this is a reinterpretation. No, it's not. It contradicts what some later theologians will say about it, but it's not a reinterpretation as if deviating from the original interpretation of a ritual, which, by the way, if you get into ritual studies and theory, it's debatable whether certain gestures have a singular meaning, right? The most we can say is that some people ascribe certain meanings to those rituals. And I'll give you an example here in a moment of an ancient Jew, contemporary of Jesus and Paul, who interprets for us what he thinks the hand-leading ritual means. But let's see what Dr. Craig says first.
You're not convinced by this. Tell us why.
All right. Well, first of all, he gives three arguments in support of the following thesis. There is no such thing as a substitutionary death sacrifice in the Torah. There are no substitutionary death sacrifices. And the three arguments he gives for this, Sean, are all non sequiturs. Now, a non sequitur is an argument which may have a true premise, but the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. And all three of his arguments are non sequiturs. So let me just share them with our listeners. First argument, he says, the premise is there is no sacrifice that can atone for sins of apostasy. Well, that's true. Israelites who committed sins of apostasy were considered to have broken the covenant, and therefore they were to be expelled from the camp, from the community. But it doesn't follow that sacrifices for sins of other types were not substitutionary sacrifices. Second argument, premise. It is not as if God desires human blood on the altar, but settles for animal blood instead. Again, that's true, but that does not imply that God does not accept the animal's life in place of what the offerer owed. Third argument, premise, God abhors human sacrifice. Again, that's true, but it doesn't follow from that the blood of the animal cannot serve as a substitute for that of the offerer. So his three arguments.
The issue here is I don't think those are his arguments in total. Those are statements that he makes with a bit of rhetorical flourish at the outset of some chapters, but you really need to actually deal with the evidence that he walks you through. But Dr. Craig is the expert in logical fallacies, so I'll defer to him.
Again, substitution are all non sequiturs. Now, in addition to that, one of the most noteworthy features of these sacrificial offerings is that they were personal offerings in which the individual bringing the sacrifice was an active participant. In particular, the offerer was required to kill the animal himself. And a telling hand-laying ceremony or ritual accompanied the slaughter of the animal. The offerer was to lay his hand upon the animal's head before he killed it. And the Hebrew expression here indicates a forceful laying of the hand. One was to press his hand upon the head of the beast to be sacrificed. And Rillera's explanation is that this hand-leaning ritual was just meant to indicate ownership of the sacrificial animal. Here's my sacrifice.
Yeah, that's right. Like, why is that so surprising to you? The only reason this would be a surprising suggestion is if you have not read any Leviticus scholarship or any scholarship on Jewish sacrifice produced over the last 50 years. This is astonishing to me that this is being presented as something that's like revisionist or new. This is what everybody agrees on now.
And I find this interpretation to be implausible and to trivialize an apparently important part of the ritual.
Okay, good. So now that we've established that point, let's actually hear from an ancient Jew on this point. I'm going to read for you a section from Philo of Alexandria. This is from his On Special Laws, Book 1. And it's worth noting that, again, when it comes to ritual sacrifice, most of the texts are more interested in kind of discussing the mode of sacrifice. So you kind of have to discern what one scholar describes as kind of an underlying sacrificial grammar to make wider assumptions about what's going on with sacrifice. A lot of good work done on this. But, it's also worth pointing out that in most cases, the writers aren't telling us what they think is happening, like what's actually going on in the sacrifice. They're just describing the rituals. You find this in a lot of rabbinic literature. It's in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But there's a guy by the name of Philo of Alexandria, for example. And here's a quote from William Gilder's Philo, which I think is an important one to note here in this conversation. He writes that Philo is unique among ancient Jewish writers on sacrifice in giving focused attention to elucidating the meaning of sacrificial rituals in conceptual terms. So Philo is interested in the spiritual meaning of these gestures. And here's what Philo says in On Special Laws, Book 1, sections 202 through 204, about the hand-leaning ritual. Quote, "In the laying on of hands on the head of the animal, we find the clearest possible type of blameless actions, and of a life saddled with nothing that lends to censure, but in harmony with the laws and statutes of nature. For the law desires that the worshipper's life should be a consistent course of the best actions, so that as he lays his hand on the victim, he can boldly and with a pure conscience speak in this wise." You gotta love the Loeb translation. "These hands have taken no gift to do injustice, no share in the proceeds of plunder or overreaching, nor been soiled with innocent blood. None have they maimed or wounded, no deed of outrage or violence have they wrought. They have done no service of any other kind at all which might incur arraignment or censure, but have made themselves humble ministers of things excellent and profitable, such as are held in honor in the sight of wisdom and the law and the wise and law-abiding men." Okay, well, there you go. There is your earliest, as far as I'm aware, explication of what the meaning of the hand ritual is. And Philo says there explicitly, it's so that the worshiper can indicate their blamelessness as they pass off the gift to the God of Israel. Because, of course, a God is not going to accept a gift from blameworthy hands, from a gift that's been incurred by injustice, by defrauding the poor or whatever. This has to be a pure gift that's given to the holy God. And so Philo says that's why we lay our hands on the victims, to remind ourselves of that and to indicate that as we hand off our gift to the priest. Was Philo a 21st century liberal progressive trying to undermine the doctrine of penal substitutionary atonement, which didn't exist when he was writing? No. He's just giving you his understanding of what's going on there. But again, this is just an example of not understanding the sources. There is no evidence that the hand leaning has anything to do with it, identification with the death of the animal.
Someone leading an animal by a rope around its neck up before the altar is just as obviously a person bringing his sacrifice as someone who carries in his hand a bird or grain for sacrifice. And if there were any doubt at all, a verbal affirmation would suffice. Here is my sacrifice. Here is my lamb. Rather, emphatic gesture of pressing one's hand on the animal's head before slitting its throat is plausibly meant to indicate the identification of the offerer with the animal, so that the animal.
I mean, that sounds like a non sequitur to me. You press your hand on top of the head of the animal, QED, it has to be identification. I mean, there's other possibilities here. We just had one from Philo. I don't understand why that has to be the way that you understand the text. There's just no indication that that's how it was understood in the ancient world. There's not. Also, if you were identifying with the animal, it's worth noting that this is clear, especially in the Masoretic text. The sacrificial activity takes place after the slaughter. So the hand leaning gesture and the slaughter on the part of the worshiper hands over the material that then becomes the sacrifice. All of that is what the priest deals with. If the slaughter was part of the sacrificial ritual, one would think the priest would be a part of doing that. And you can find then in the Septuagint tradition and some other traditions where they start to play with this idea that the priest is the one doing the slaughtering. But the emphasis is always on what you do then with the blood procured from the sacrifice and the meat that gets burnt upon the altar. Another point, if the idea was to substitute yourself with the animal in some sort of like penal way, why is this involved in all types of sacrifices? Right? Why is the death of the animal involved in the shalomim, the well-being offering? There's no atonement in the shalomim. It's a well-being offering. It's engaging with God. It's having a meal with the divine. You're not atoning for anything. You're not apologizing for anything. You're simply giving your gift to God. So yes, you would want to identify that ritually. This is mine. This is coming from my stock, and I'm giving a part of it back to God. That's what the hand ritual is doing. And underneath that, if we want to theologize from that, I think is this idea of sacrifice is ultimately about the ability to give the self back to God. It's about communion between God and humanity. But it's not this idea of substitution here. It's not there.
Fate symbolizes his own. And that's why Leviticus promises, and I quote, "It shall be acceptable in your behalf as atonement for you." Leviticus 1:4.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it says about the burnt offering. And there's conversations about the burnt offering and distinguishing that from the use of kippur when it comes to the chatat or sin offering and the asham, the reparation offering. But we're not just laying our hand on an animal and killing the animal when it involves atonement. That's just part of any type of sacrificial ritual. The olah, the shalomim, the chatat, and the asham. Like all of that. That's just the first part of the setup for the animal. Also, what do you do with the grain offering, right? If you're poor and you can't bring from your stock because you can't afford it. You can't afford to bring an expensive gift, the animal. You can't even afford a smaller animal. What does the Lord provide? Bring some grain then. Is the grain a substitute for the worshiper? The grain is, as it burns, it's dying on behalf of the worshiper. That makes no sense. But in Leviticus 4, for people that can't afford an animal or of any kind, there's a provision for grain for a regular sin offering. So there's just all these places where this truncated reading that's being offered here just doesn't make sense.
Death is the penalty for sin, and the animal dies in place of the worshiper.
Right. Again, so why would you have that illustrated when you're doing a well-being offering? Or why would you say, is it only rich people that need that being illustrated to them in Leviticus chapter 4? Only the priest needs that visual illustration. Only the rich person, a person that's impoverished, doesn't need that visual illustration as well. It doesn't make sense. And it's not what the ancient sources say.
Now, that's not to say that the animal was punished in the place of the worshiper, but the animal suffered the death that would have been the worshiper's punishment had it been inflicted on him.
Your point about the three arguments that he gives against substitution being non sequiturs is really important, I think, for people to see, because especially on your first point, there's a difference between saying there's a substitution and a sacrifice for every single sin, including apostasy, which is not the claim, versus there is a substitutionary atonement that's accepted for some sins. That's what the claim is. And I think that clarification you're drawing out is really helpful.
Good.
All right. So this was one of the most interesting points in the book to me. So I'm really curious your take on this one, Bill.
Okay.
Is that he argues that the biological death of the sacrificial animal is not about death, but rather as a, quote, presentation of life. Thus, it's not about substitution. So it's almost like he puts this spin on it I totally didn't see coming that says, well, biological.
Again, the only way you wouldn't see that coming is if you hadn't read any scholarship on Leviticus in the last 50 years.
Death is really not even about death at all. Reinterprets it. I found that fascinating on one level, bizarre on another, but I'm really curious your take on that.
Yes. In cases of animal sacrifice, the animal's life is given instead of the sinner's, and thus the animal's death is of vital importance. And this is confirmed by the centrality of death in other atonement narratives in the Pentateuch, such as Moses' offer to die in order to make atonement for the sin of the people, or Phinehas's making atonement for Israel's sin by killing the malefactors, or the prescription.
So, I mean, I think this is a problem of, he's right. The term kippur is used outside of the priestly source. And when I say priestly source, I'm talking about Leviticus, particularly Leviticus 1 through 16, but then also the holy that followed. You can't just simply take these texts and talk about, so what does atonement mean? I mean, maybe we should have just begun with that. The term kippur has something to do with an act of removing, right? And that's a broad term that can apply outside of the cult. You can remove the consequences of things. Within Leviticus, though, we have to look at what kippur is actually doing and how it's functioning. And that's a lot of what Rillera's book is doing, is looking at that. And again, you can disagree with his interpretation of certain things, but this review is not even getting at the level of his argument. It's simply reasserting what they think is going on, what they believe, without actually looking at at his argument. It's starting to get tiring. We'll see how much more I can do here.
To make atonement for an unsolved murder by breaking the neck of a heifer in the vicinity of the corpse. In all of these, death is a critical element. Now, Rillera.
Yeah, and just to point out, Numbers 35, how do you make atonement? How do you purify the land? I mean, right, the land, if the land is defiled by murder, it's only the blood of the murder that purifies the land, that kippurs the land. So yeah, death is involved there. You can't then extrapolate from that death is like the central part of the rituals that make kippur in the sanctuary. I mean, that's a non sequitur.
Asserts, and I quote, "Whatever is happening for atoning sacrifices, they most definitely cannot be conceptualized as a substitutionary death, because the whole reality of the event has been transformed via ritual so that it has nothing to do whatsoever with death." And again, he says, the death of sacrificial animals never holds any ritual or theological significance. Now, these claims are so outrageous, Sean, as to be disingenuous.
I don't actually think he's being disingenuous here, and I don't think it's that outrageous. It may be slightly overstated. Death is absolutely involved in these rituals, and it's a necessary part of it. But if you look at the ritual framework of these sacrifices, the slaughter, the hand leading in the slaughter, is prerequisite to the rituals and to what's done with blood. There's so much good literature on this; it's hard to pick out one or two. But certainly the works of Jacob Milgram, his commentaries on Leviticus, William Gilder's work on this is also really good on blood ritual in the Hebrew Bible. So I again, to call this disingenuous is just demonstrates a fundamental lack of knowledge of the scholarship. And again, if we're going to stay in our lanes, part of staying in your lane would be becoming more aware of what scholars have been saying about these rituals over the past 50 years or more. Also becoming aware of what the ancient sources say about these rituals. We just keep asserting that we can't find, we find it unbelievable what's being proposed here, but most of what Rillera is proposing is following in the footsteps of Milgram.
Yes, the ritual reconceptualizes the animal's death. That's true. The reconceptualization of the animal's death via ritual makes it a sacrifice, but no less a death.
This is another misunderstanding. What makes a sacrifice in antiquity seems to be more so the act of giving the gift to the god, whether or not that involves death. And I actually have one more quote I'll read from you real quick. This is actually from one of the, I think the leading work on ancient Mediterranean sacrifice. There's two books that are really important. F.S. Naden's book, Smoke Signals for the Gods, which makes the point that in Greek sacrifice, the wafting up of the aroma, very much like the sweet-smelling aroma that goes up in the Jewish cult, that was really the point of emphasis in Greek sacrifice, that it was accompanied by prayer, not necessarily the killing of animals. This is from J.B. Rives's book on animal sacrifice in the Roman Empire, the definitive work now, in my opinion, on this topic. And he writes this. This is just, again, giving you broader context of sacrifice in antiquity. He writes this, quote, "Although there were also specialized Greek and Latin nouns to denote animal victims, the two languages, Greek and Latin, did not otherwise make a sharp distinction between animal and vegetal offerings. Instead, most of the relevant terminology applies to both types of offerings, suggesting that people regarded them as more or less equivalent in terms of their efficacy in the winning of the goodwill of the gods. Animal sacrifice, as distinct from vegetal offerings, is thus more a modern than an ancient category." So, okay, that's not biblical material, but within the broader world in which we're discussing sacrifice, people, generally speaking, did not focus on the killing of an animal, quad killing, as the thing that made the sacrifice. If that were the case, you couldn't substitute vegetal offerings for the animal, like in Leviticus 4, where the grain, in the case of economic disparity, the grain can be substituted for the animal. Right. So if killing was the thing that was kind of like the main event of the sacrifice, you would expect it to receive the focus of the rituals that we find in the broader Greco-Roman world and in the Hebrew Bible. And that's not what we find. What we find that gets the focus over and over and over again is what's done with the blood in and around the altars, and what's done with the meat, the parts of the animal that are burned on the altar, that's offered as a gift up to the god. I think what's happening again is just there's this assumption. The beginning framework is Christ's death saves us. It atones for our sins. He died as a sacrifice. Therefore, the center of sacrifice is death. And now we have to insist on finding it everywhere in the Old Testament, and it's not there.
A great analogy for this is in our judicial system. The reconceptualization of a killing by giving an affirmative defense showing that the defendant had justification or excuse for the killing makes the killing a homicide rather than a murder. But it remains a killing nonetheless. So on Rillera's view, imagine this: if ancient Israel had practiced bloodletting of animals rather than sacrifice, merely drawing some of their blood and presenting it to God on the altar would have sufficed to atone for Israel's sins.
No, because if you pay attention to what the texts say, the animal is also burnt up, or parts of the animal are burnt up on the altar. The entire ritual complex is what leads to the result of kippur, in the priestly source at least. It is true that in later rabbinic literature, most emphasis gets put specifically on blood application as being the constituent element of sacrifice. But again, for the rabbis, it's not the killing of the animal. It's what you do with the blood afterwards.
So the fundamental failing, I think, of people who try to minimize the animal's death in the process of atonement is they're trying to divide up and separate or isolate different phases of the ritual when in fact it all coheres together in a unified process.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I think that there's a hierarchical nature to the rituals, as Roy Gain and others have argued. I think you definitely see emphasis on aspects of the rituals being really important. The burning of the flesh and the blood in the priestly literature and in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then within some early Christian texts and rabbinic literature, especially what you do, the blood or the efficacy of the blood. But I would agree that it's all part of the same ritual. But in terms of what gets the emphasis, it's definitely the other things. It's not the killing. The killing is prerequisite to what priests do with the sacrifice.
It's really helpful to tie it together. And one thing I wondered, and I wonder if I was missing something, is he's very apt to critique the God who would use penal substitutionary atonement. And so if we can remove the actual death from this, then it seems to minimize it. But then it seems to raise the question, why does the animal need to die at all? What's the point? And so then on this God, it's like, wait a minute, you're requiring the death of this God. And he has a passage in the Bible in which he says, in certain circumstances, killing an animal is akin to murder. And so why would this be necessary at all? It seems to raise the very problem of the character of God that he's trying to escape.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't. But fine.
Okay, so let's keep going here on this one, because we're asking the question about bloodshed even being necessary for atonement in the Old Testament at all. And so if a person cannot afford a lamb, goat, or say a bird, and this is a point that Rillera makes, they can offer flour. We see this in Leviticus 5:11 through 13. And we also see forgiveness being offered apart from the sacrificial system, seemingly entirely in Psalm.
Okay, it's good that they're at least getting to this point now.
Psalm 32 and Isaiah 38. So if bloodshed is not necessary, then why do we need a substitute in the first place?
I think the verse for substitutionary death or shedding of blood is Leviticus 17:11. It states, and I quote, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. It is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life." So God has given to Israel this sacrificial system of making atonement, cleansing them from impurity and sin. Now, in the case of persons who are desperately poor and cannot afford an animal sacrifice, they are allowed by God to offer a grain offering instead. This is a gracious condescension of God to them in their need. But the norm that he has set is that it will be by offering a substitutionary death in the place of the sinner that.
Yeah, this whole conversation though needs to be filled in by what blood is actually doing in the ritual and how it actually cleanses. So You need to, I don't know, engage, for example, Jacob Milgram's work on blood as ritual detergent and how that works. These ideas that they're not coming out of nowhere. There's similar concepts in other surrounding cultures. But that's what's going on there. The blood is brought into the altar to make atonement on it, to cleanse it from the sins of the people. I mean, that's what's going on. And here's one place where I would disagree with Rillera and agree with people like Roy Gain and others. I do think the people are also, the consequences of the sin are also removed from the people. So there's atonement both made on the altar or the various sancta and the individual who offers it, in the case of a chatat offering. But again, this is Leviticus 17:11 is definitely an important text. It needs to, it gets a lot of emphasis in post-biblical literature. But we have to kind of, again, think about like what it's doing.
Will make atonement.
That's fair. I've also had a response like, what about when Jonah goes and preaches to the Ninevites and they repent without sacrificial system, but their repentance was still accepted through, in part, the sacrificial system that God had set up with the Jewish people. So we can't.
Where does it ever say that in the text? You're just reading that in.
Completely separate those. I think that's an interesting point to bring in as a possibility for this.
Yes. Now, the Ninevites weren't Jewish, though, so
right.
God can institute whatever system he wants with them. From a New Testament perspective.
Oh, interesting. God can institute whatever system he wants. So the logic of a lot of these questions that they're raising, like, well, why would you have to kill the animal if it's just all of those things? That part of the answer to that could simply be because Yahweh says so, because this is the system that Yahweh is set up. It doesn't mean QED, everything that follows is, it's all about death and killing and punishment like that. These don't, yeah, I guess I would say non sequiturs.
Now, speaking theologically, the author of Hebrews says it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. So in a sense, this whole system was just conventional. God had set it up until someday that perfect lamb would come, Jesus, Messiah, who would.
So I would distinguish here. I think this is my reading of Hebrews. I think Hebrews absolutely thinks that the Jewish cult does exactly what Leviticus says it does. The cult cannot, this Rillera makes this point, it wasn't designed to take away sins in an ultimate sense, right? Eschatological atonement. Why could it not? Well, as the writer of Hebrews says, you do the same ritual every year. But that does not mean that the writer doesn't have deep respect for the Pentateuch and for the things that the rituals say they do. The writer of Hebrews says that these rituals actually do cleanse things. They do cleanse sancta. The worshiper's flesh is cleansed by certain ritual actions. No, Jesus actually can't be a priest in the earthly tabernacle because he doesn't have the genealogical requirements. The Torah matters greatly for the writer of Hebrews, but the kind of sacrifice that he's arguing for there in Hebrews 9, he's talking about Jesus entering into the heavenly Holy of Holies, right? It's to offer a cosmic atonement. That's a level of atonement that transcends what we see happening in the priestly literature. It's not antithetical to it, it's just greater than. That's the writer's argument.
Would then die decisively for the sins of the world, not only ours, but also for these people whose judgment was forestalled by their offering these animal sacrifices along the way. One of my students offered the interesting analogy that these sacrifices were sort of like a credit card that people could pay for their sins, but ultimately the bill would come due. And it was Jesus who finally paid that bill decisively and settled.
Oh, all right. I'm losing steam, and I got to get to helping another student with something. But just to point out that last analogy, I'd say a better analogy would be something like a factory reset button, to quote from another scholar. In fact, Rillera has a number of analogies to discuss what the sacrifices are doing and the Day of Atonement, which I think are more helpful. But what are the sacrifices doing? It's maintenance, it's covenant maintenance throughout the year so that Yahweh's presence can remain among the people in anticipation of the Day of Cleansing, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, which would be like a factory reset for the sanctuary so that Yahweh could remain among the people. And what's this all about? It's about God's desire to dwell with humanity. And that's, I think, as a Christian, I think that's what we find most fully in the person of Jesus Christ, in his death, his incarnation, his life, death, resurrection, ascension, and ongoing mediation on our behalf. And there's a ton of ways in which those intersect with and build on the sacrificial system we find in Leviticus. And I would say there's a lot of food for thought in Rillera's book. So in closing, let me just encourage everybody. I think it is a great book, well worth reading. I've yet to read an academic book on the level of Rillera's book where I didn't find places where I disagreed. I'm sure people would say the same about everything I've written. And in fact, I find stuff that I disagree with that I wrote years ago, but it's a really well done book in many ways. As I said, it is kind of two books. It's the larger argument of takedown of penal substitution and the more granular look at Jewish sacrifice and then text in the New Testament. That part interests me more, to be honest. But I very much appreciate the book. And I just think it's unfortunate that McDowell and Craig don't really engage with the substance of the book. I frankly don't know that they really understood it. The fact that he kept saying he denies atonement, that led me to realize, like, okay, there's just a fundamental misunderstanding here. And again, my final plea would be, I think we need, if we want to develop really good doctrine about the atonement, we need biblical scholars who are willing to be in deep conversation with the tradition and not just treat it antagonistically, but be in good conversation with the tradition. And we need historical and systematic theologians who want to dialogue with biblical scholars and really get into those texts. And we need the philosophers as well to help us think through models. And so it takes a lot of work. And I think it's worth having that conversation. And I appreciate Dr. Rillera's book, his contribution that he's made. I think it's a really important book and should be read widely. Again, I've left some resources for you in the description of this video. My article on atonement and biblical traditions gives, I think, a pretty good summary of where the scholarship is at. I'll also link my edited volume on atonement, a lot of really good scholarship there, and a couple other resources that you may find interesting. So thanks for hanging in with me. I lost steam. I couldn't do a response to the whole thing, but hopefully this much is helpful. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about sacrifice out there within the church, and I actually think it does lead to a lot of bad theology. And so correcting some of those to me is really helpful. And yeah, with that, I'll sign off. All right, thanks everybody.